Okay, welcome again, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight for our public informational meeting. This is our second meeting of this week. We had one earlier on Tuesday, June 8th, but we do know that today is Thursday, June 10th. I just wanted to let you know you're in the right place at the right time. This meeting will be about the planning phase of the Woonasquatucket River Watershed Flood Protection Project. So let's begin. Next slide, please. Okay, we wanted to just start off with a little brief orientation about how we have this particular meeting set up. You will see down at the bottom of your screen the bar of information. There's a Q&A option versus a chat option, and we would prefer that you put your questions in the Q&A. We will be taking questions at the end of the presentation and have time for open discussion as well. So if you think of questions along the way, anytime you think of them, feel free to put them in the Q&A and we will get to them later this evening. And the chat is really more so for information if you're having technical difficulties with the presentation, if you ever lose sound or can't see the slides or something like that, please do let us know. We have a technical representative there monitoring the chat as well as the Q&A, and he will be able to provide assistance to you. We also wanted to let you know that tonight we have an interpretation for Spanish language available. If you see the interpretation symbol on the bottom bar over towards the right side of the screen, it's circled on this slide, and you can choose to be on the Spanish channel or the English channel, and you can toggle back and forth throughout the presentation and choose, whichever line you want to be on. So that's totally at your discretion and is there for your convenience. We also wanted to let you know that you are all muted, and that will be just for the first part of this presentation while we're giving the presentation. But when we open up for question and answer, then we will be able to unmute you as you raise your hand to ask a question. So we can be respectful of everybody. We want to try not to have people talking over one another. So we're just going to unmute people one at a time. All right. And so if you have any questions, please, like I said, put them in the Q&A. And if you're having any technical difficulties, please type them in the chat. You're welcome to type technical difficulties in the chat in Spanish as well. And we will provide assistance to you. Okay, next slide, please. So the Woonasquatucket River Watershed Plan, that is what we are here to present to you tonight in terms of opening discussion. We are in the beginning of developing that plan. And so NRCS, my agency, I am with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. We're an agency of the United States Department of Agriculture, and we refer to this as the planning phase for watershed flood protection projects. And so in this phase, what we're looking to do is to develop a watershed plan - environmental document. That environmental document will typically be in the style of an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement, if you're familiar with those. So on the screen now, we just wanted to show you and give you a little orientation to the Woonasquatucket River watershed, and also tell you how the flow of the meeting tonight will run. So for our agenda tonight, we do have instructions and background information, which and introductions as well, which I'll be providing, and then planning team roles, project background information, outline of the planning process and flood mitigation strategies, measures, examples of different techniques and practices that we use to accomplish flood protection in communities. We'll also talk about next steps. And then at the very end, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, we will have time for questions and answers and just open discussions if you want to make comments, if you want to let us know of areas of flooding concern for you, or areas where you have just observed flooding during different storms. Some places flood more frequently than others. You can talk about that as well. So we'll have plenty of time at the end of the presentation. The presentation is a little bit over an hour, but then we have over 30 minutes after that for also questions and answers. So we will carry on with that in mind. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, I am Ayana Brown. I'm a conservation engineer with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and we are an agency within the United States Department of Agriculture. So we are the federal sponsor on this project. We also have here with us tonight, Mr. David Everett. He is the Principal City Planner with the City of Providence. And Mr. Michael Phillips is the Town Planner for the Town of Smithfield. As well, we have Mr. Jeffrey Tucker, who will be presenting a little bit later. He's the project manager for our engineering consultants on the project, Ddk Engineering. We have Mr. Chris Sargent. He is the senior environmental planner with Ddk Engineering, and he will be providing you technical assistance in the Q&A as well as the chat. And then we also have presenting tonight, Mr. Andrew Hoke. He's the senior water resources engineer with Ddk Engineering. Okay, next slide. All right, so who is the USDA NRCS, and specifically our program that we are rolling out now with the City of Providence and the Town of Smithfield, called the Watershed and Flood Prevention Operations Program. We are, as I mentioned, an agency within the Department of Agriculture, and therefore we help all over the United States. We have an office and field offices in every state and most territories in the country. And Rhode Island's office is actually in Warwick, and that is a combination office of our state office and field offices together. And we help anyone who requests help and then is qualified through the program. So this is a voluntary program. This is not the federal government coming in and saying you have a problem and you need to do something about it, so we're going to lead you through it. No, this is a situation where the problem was recognized by your local government representatives through the City of Providence and the Town of Smithfield that they had some flooding concerns, and they approached us with an application to the program. So we do mostly work with entities of government, elected officials or people who are appointed, and then their staffs. So next slide, please. All right, and where we help. As part of the Department of Agriculture, we do have a focus on agriculture and rural communities for our programs. And in this program in particular, the Watershed and Flood Prevention Operations Program, we have a requirement that any watershed project that we take on has at least a 20% rural or agricultural benefit. So I know a lot of times when we think about both the City of Providence and the Town of Smithfield, we may not see a lot of rural area in there, but you do have quite a bit of non-industrialized forest in the Town of Smithfield. And then in the City of Providence, you have a good bit of agriculture in the form of urban agriculture, in terms of backyard conservation, in terms of Gotham Greens, and other operations like that, which you may not think of as traditional agriculture, but NRCS doesn't only focus on what someone may regard as traditional agriculture. We focus on all agricultural operations, and that all contributes towards the 20% needed to qualify, among other things, for this program. So we wanted to highlight some of the agriculture that you do have in Rhode Island as a whole, and specifically in the Town of Smithfield and the City of Providence. As you know, Rhode Island is very big into mushroom farming, and so you have a few producers who are doing that, and you also have wild mushrooms that are growing in your non-industrialized forests as well. So that's great. We also have agriculture in the form of aquaculture, as I mentioned, with Gotham Greens, but also with fish hatcheries. You have some producers doing various scales of operations of just doing fish hatcheries, and that is definitely a need, as we need that for our recreation facilities in the state and also other states throughout New England. Additionally, you have some outstanding cattle and dairy operations in Rhode Island, which I hope that a lot of people were able to find as a relief during the pandemic, when we were in the heart of it, really, to know that you have food that is grown locally, and you can feel a little bit more secure about your food source when you know that it's coming from just, the next town over, or maybe as far as the next county over, but still in your state. And that's very nice to have, and I think that's important for our country and our infrastructure. So we encourage you to continue to support agriculture in Rhode Island. Okay. So next slide, please. Okay, and so these are some pictures as we were discussing Gotham Greens. You can see it all lit up there at night. It looks quite pretty, even through the rain. And then you can see some lovely cattle at Deep Roots Farm, and they're beautiful tulips. It's just a great day to be outside and be on the farm that day. So agriculture in Rhode Island, there it is, definitely more proof. Okay, next slide. Okay, and some of the ways that we help with flood prevention measures through the Watershed and Flood Prevention Operations Program that you may be familiar with. You may have heard of us in terms of building a lot of dams. We have been offering this program to the public for decades now, and we have a little bit over 11,000 dams all across the country. We didn't build any dams. We have not built any dams in Rhode Island under this program, but these are some pictures of some of the dams or the typical setups that you might see. Our dams are traditionally earthen dams, but they may be overlain with rock or concrete as a protective cover on the slopes or on the top, either way. But always we have an outlet structure to allow the release of water through the dam and back into the natural stream channel eventually. Some parts of it may be concrete lined like the picture that you see on the left here. But eventually it will get back into the natural stream channel, and that's our goal, is just to control it where it needs to be controlled, and then where it doesn't, we will allow it to go back into its natural state. Okay, so we also have other ways that we can help with flood prevention measures and have, especially up and down the East Coast. So next slide. And these are two examples. On the right, you see Irrigation Channel. And that is something that we also do in terms of flood protection. We will make sure that there is still an avenue to provide water for agriculture and agricultural production, but also, as I mentioned in the previous slide, for the natural habitat in the streams. So we're not looking to remove all of the water. We're just trying to address the flooding concerns with the water. So at some point you will see irrigation channels come into the mix in certain projects, because it's good to separate out the flood water from the water that's being used for agricultural production or another use. And then on the left side of the screen, you can see a flood protection channel. So there are a lot of parts of the country where the landscape really doesn't lend itself to a dam, and a dam will not be one of the practical measures to be installed. So another option that we have also used are flood protection channels or canals. And the area that you see there just a little bit to the right of the actual water surface, that is what we refer to as the buffer and then the maintenance area. So in all of our projects, we have a requirement for not only the space of the structure itself, whatever the flood protection measure is, but also some maintenance area. And definitely if we can get a good buffer established there between any type of area that's driven on that might be construed as a roadway and the actual open water surface, we try to do that. For infiltration and also to limit the number of pollutants that are introduced or reintroduced to the water. So that is typical, and that is what we like to see. And as we move forward with the project, that will always be included in our plans. NRCS always has a requirement for operation and maintenance for the sponsors to undertake. And so in helping them to meet that requirement, we make sure that we include it from the very beginning in the design, in the plan, and so it goes to construction. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so our Watershed and Flood Prevention Operations Program is actually an authority that we were granted through 4 different laws at different times during our history. The first law is there on the 3rd bullet, and it is from the Flood Control Act of 1944, and a lot of times that's referred to as PL 534. And so that gave us certain authorities to do certain things with watersheds and to provide flood protection and other features. And then in 1954, we had a couple of other laws passed, the Watershed and Flood Protection Act and Flood Prevention Act, of 1954, that is commonly referred to as PL 566. That, along with the pilot watershed program being authorized under the Department of Agriculture's Appropriations Act in 1954, gave us more authority to do a little bit more, to have a few more avenues that we can help with watershed protection. And it also gave us authorization and funding. So along with authorization for a program, you need funding for a program, and that's what the Appropriations Act actually did for us, and that was great. So we could actually roll this program out to the public and see its effect on the landscape. And then in 1981, the Resource and Conservation Development Program was authorized under the Agriculture and Food Act. And although that program has since been deauthorized, any dams that were constructed under that authority, along with dams that were constructed under the authorities of these other three laws, for a total of 4 laws, they are eligible for our watershed rehabilitation program, which is a component under the overarching watershed and flood prevention operations program. So that is just something that I wanted to point out to you, because you may know of some dams, some small pond dams, some irrigation dams that were constructed in Rhode Island, or you may see some in other states that were not constructed under one of these 4 authorities, and wonder what the difference is. So that is the difference in terms of qualifying for rehabilitation assistance once a dam has already reached or exceeded its service life. It has to be built under one of these 4 authorities for it to be eligible for NRCS's watershed rehabilitation program, even if we otherwise assisted with its building initially for on-farm purposes. So, and on the right side of the screen here, this is another good picture of the watershed. And you can see the delineation really well here for where the land lies for the town of Smithfield and for the watershed overall, and the city of Providence. So you can see that the town of Smithfield has a pretty big investment in the Woonasquatucket River watershed, and that the city of Providence is receiving a lot of water as they are down there towards the outlet of the watershed. So definitely 2 good municipalities to have involved in the project, and to get on one accord with how we're going to address some flood prevention measures. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so NRCS and what we do in watershed projects under this program, the Watershed and Flood Prevention Operations Program, we are the administrator of the project. We are providing funding for the project, the majority of the funding for the project, for the technical development of document that I mentioned earlier, the watershed plan and the hyphen environmental document. So in that, we coordinate with government agencies, and we also coordinate with the public. And we are in the first phase, and NRCS is in it for all 3 phases. And the other 2 phases are design and then construction or installation. So this is, as I mentioned earlier, phase 1, planning. And throughout planning, we will be doing reviews of project documents and being part of the project team just overall. Okay, next slide. And the role of local sponsors are incredibly important to the watershed project. As I mentioned earlier, with NRCS's program, we will not have a project if we did not have sponsorship. And so we're very excited to be partnering with the city of Providence and the town of Smithfield, and happy to know that they were able to prioritize the flooding concerns of their communities and to be able to address them now with us. And in that process, the town and the city have some responsibilities as well, and tasks that they accomplished under their own funding with regards to interacting with the public, responding to public inquiries, participating in meetings like this, obtaining permits, and as well as land rights acquisition and utilities coordination. So land rights acquisition could be the outright giving of an easement by a landowner. You know, it might not be a lot of property, and so they might say, okay, just go ahead and take it. I'll do it to have the flooding reduced on my property or in my neighborhood. Or there may be some outright property purchases that are done where the town or the city acquire land and make sure that it's able to be used to be an effective feature in this overarching program. So along with that, they have long-term operation and maintenance responsibilities for the flood protection measures that are installed. In this program, we have a requirement that we install measures that can be maintained and operated for a minimum of 50 years and a maximum of 100 years. Some do last longer, believe it or not, depending upon how development occurs around them. But that is another requirement in the program, that we're going to have features that are going to last that long. So we need to have a commitment from the sponsors up front that they're willing to maintain it for that long, so that we can make sure that the public is getting the benefit that we all, NRCS and the sponsors together, promised that you would. Okay, next slide, please. All right, and as I mentioned earlier, we have NRCS is contracted with an engineering consultant firm, Ddk Engineering, and they are here to do a lot of our technical work and help us, and they're part of the project team. They conduct field reconnaissance and gather background data. They complete various engineering and scientific analyses to characterize the watershed in terms of not only just the water flow, but how people and animals are interacting in the watershed. We do want to make sure we're part of the, we have conservation in our name for a reason, and we do want to make sure that when we're going through this process, that we are coming up with alternatives and ideas and plans that will react well in the natural environment and also react well for the people who are living there too, and not just be something that is technically sound, but we have to consider nature and people as well. So they will be doing that in their work too. And they also develop and evaluate the prevention strategies and some of the measures that Andy is going to talk to you about a little bit later to give you examples of what we're talking about there. And they will be preparing project documents as we go along in this process. Jeff will talk to you about that in a little bit more detail, but there will be other opportunities for comment, definitely. So if you have something that you think of after this comment period closes, that won't be the last time to bring it up. We will have other public meetings as we progress with this project and have more information to share with you. So those are some of the project documents that we will create as a team, and then we will be presenting to you as the public. Okay, next slide, please. All right, and the role of the public, all of you, everyone who lives and works in this watershed, we definitely want to hear from you. If your school is in this watershed, we want to hear from you. We want to know what you think about what's going on with the flooding, how it's inconveniencing you, how much flooding you're getting, and when it happens. You know, and any comments that you have about anything with regards to the flooding that's been going on in your neighborhoods or on the roads that you travel in this watershed, we definitely want to hear about it, and we want to know, because we want to make this plan as comprehensive for the town and the city in the Woonasquatucket River watershed as we possibly can. So that's why we have meetings like this. That's why we have established the project email address, and we invite you to submit questions tonight, but also to use that email address if you want to submit questions or comments or just relay information to us. And we'll receive all of that information and make sure that it is incorporated into the watershed plan as we move forward. And we're just looking forward definitely to hearing your thoughts on this project, and make sure that this is a priority for you too, and something that you like to see the city and the town address now. Because this is your community, this is your neighborhood, and you should have a say. Okay, next slide, please. All right, and the role of project partners. The Woonasquatucket River Watershed Council is definitely a partner on this project. They first approached NRCS to learn more about the Watershed and Flood Prevention Operations Program, and then they went out and they shared it with other towns and the city in the Woonasquatucket River Watershed. So they have been a great project partner, and they have developed MOUs or memorandums of understanding with the city of Providence and the town of Smithfield to be a partner on this project. So they provided us information, a lot of background information that will be discussed just briefly in a little bit, and also are participating in outreach to make sure that we get the word out and that as many people know about this project as possible who live in the watershed, so that they can weigh in on their thoughts and their concerns. And if people are worried about how it might turn out or what might happen to their property, they can express those concerns to us, and then we can make sure that we address them, because we do want to be sensitive to the issues and how you use the land. Okay, next slide, please. So we'll talk about a little bit here, a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of the project background, an outline of the planning process, just generally speaking. And then, as we've talked about, we're going to show you some flood prevention measures, some different strategies that we have found to be successful in the past in communities of a similar type of landscape as yours. And we'll see. We haven't made any decisions yet. We're just presenting you with ideas and options and things that we know have worked in the past, because that is a goal and a priority of NRCS. This is not a trial program. It's not a pilot program. As I mentioned, when we install watershed features for flood protection, we expect for them to last for 50 to 100 years with proper operation and maintenance. We know that there will be maintenance, but it is not a trial and error program. It's not something where we're looking to try something out that was invented yesterday. We're looking to install proven techniques that have worked before. And so we expect them to continue to work given the right design and the right construction and the right operation and maintenance. Okay, next slide. So why are we here? Obviously, in the city of Providence, in the town of Smithfield, there's been some flooding. To put it mildly, there's been some flooding over the last decade or more on the roads, in parking lots, in homes, unfortunately, that has been inconvenient and increased and decreased rather, I'm sorry, the safety in the area as people try to traverse and go about their normal lives. And we want to be able to help with the flooding while also allowing the river itself to function as naturally as we possibly can, considering the interaction with humans and the built environment. Okay, next slide. Okay, thank you. Okay, and so why this project? I know that you are aware, as people who live in the community, you've probably been hearing about the flooding and people studying the flooding for a while. But in 2020, the city of Providence and the town of Smithfield requested assistance from NRCS through our Watershed and Flood Prevention Operations Program. And so we are here specifically not only to study the situation, but to come up with alternatives and solutions, and then to select a set of solutions in the form of one alternative, and then to install it. So we're looking to move all the way into construction. And as I mentioned, that's a separate phase. We're not in the construction phase yet because we haven't finished the plan phase to identify the alternatives and then choose the best set of alternatives as our preferred one. But that is the goal of this project. This project is not just a study to see what's going on. We know that that has been done before, and we will do some studying because some time has passed between other reports. But the end goal is construction for this to actually relieve some of the flooding that's going on. So that's the plan. Okay, next slide, please. All right, and here again, you can see some pictures from some flooding in 2010 on streets, and some of it is, quite deep and makes the roads impassable, not just a little bit dangerous to traverse, but really enough water to float a car. So very scary. And we know that the river exists, and rivers are all over the place, all over the country, and specifically in Rhode Island, you have a lot of interaction with water between the river and the ocean. So we have to find a way for us to work together and for you to be able to live there while experiencing the benefits of the river, but also allowing the river to function a little bit more naturally, as we have learned as a scientific community more about what rivers need and how we can interact with them and still have our homes and schools and businesses in the area and how they should be laid out in relation to the river. So we don't have this situation so much anymore is the goal. Okay, next slide, please. And NRCS recognizes that you already have flood protection measures that have been installed by the city, by the town, by partnering with other federal agencies such as the Army Corps of Engineers. You do have a hurricane barrier at Fox Point. It looks a little bit like the examples I have shown in these pictures. Not exactly, it's more concrete, but similar. And we're not here in this project to take that over. That is being operated in partnership between the City of Providence and the Army Corps of Engineers, and we respect that relationship. And we also respect the Corps' ability to do their own style and type of flood prevention work. And the work that they've done has been good and is benefiting the city. And anything that is existing that is good and is benefiting, we just look to piggyback on that. We're not looking to take it out and redo it just for the sake of redoing it. Absolutely not. We are spending taxpayer dollars, and we want to be responsible about that and respectful of things that you already have installed that are working. And so there's no reason for us to go in and try to change it if it's working. And if it's something that is not working, we can hear about it in this project, but that does not mean that it's going to become something that is under NRCS's authority. The original federal agency that constructed it and or is operating and maintaining it now in some form or fashion is still the federal agency that would need to be involved in any modification to it. So we just wanted to highlight that good work and talk about that a little bit. And if you go to the next slide, please, I think. We are ready to transition. So I'm going to turn over the next portion of this presentation to Mr. Jeffrey Tucker with Ddk Engineering. He is a project manager. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ayana, and good evening, everyone. And thank you for your time this evening. We greatly appreciate it. I would just like to walk us through the next handful of slides to get a little bit more detail to the project. And then soon we'll be turning it over to Andy Hoke to get to some of the mitigation type topics. But as we said, the Woonasquatucket River watershed encompasses approximately 52 square miles. It's a good size mass of land. The graphic over on your right side of the screen, in the green indicates sort of the more rural areas. That's up in the northwestern portion of the watershed. And as it flows, the river makes its way down left to right, and we enter into the more urbanized areas of the watershed. And as we get closer down into the city of Providence. We indicate on the second bullet here that within the city itself, the drainage area is approximately 5.9 square miles, or a little over 10%, I think, of the total drainage area of the river. About 24.4% is located within the town of Smithfield, and then the remainder in the balance in the North Providence, North Smithfield, Johnston, and Gloucester. Approximately 36% of this overall land area is developed, a combination or a mix of low to medium, high intensity. And relative to the people living within the watershed, about half of it or so is within the city limits, so the city of Providence limits. Next slide, please. Okay, as Ayana indicated earlier, this project is to build upon the work that has been done. It's not a redo and just a study. So we put this slide in just to, illustrate, a lot of the good work that has been done, the information that we have collected at our end. And as we go through and really make sure that we're clear, as I said, what work that has been done by others and good work, and make sure that we're aware of and utilizing and implementing that. Next slide, please. Okay, so a little bit on the watershed planning process and overview. We're going to be laying out a rough timeline. We're going to talk about a purpose and need and the planning process, the outline and activities. We'll touch base a little bit on different resources within the watershed, human resources, environmental as well. And as we mentioned, the flood protection, damage reduction, potential solutions. Next slide. Okay, relative to the timeline, as Ayana has indicated earlier, we're in the planning process of this overall project. So our objective, our mission, if you will, is to go through and really collect information, fact finding, and better understand where the real areas that we need to be focusing are, identify an array of potential mitigative measures, evaluate those measures, and really go through this whole planning, which is about 1.5 years or 18 months or so. The conclusion of that, the watershed report, is going to be identifying, we'll talk about that in a moment, some specific things that would be carried forward into implementation. The first phase of implementation is design, and then followed by construction. As you can see here, as I just mentioned, planning is about 1.5 years, designs upwards to 2 years, and followed by construction, depending on the extent, things like that. It could take a couple of years, potentially up to 5. Next slide, please. All righty, so we mentioned this term purpose and need, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about that. Purpose and need is a very important document that's used as part of the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. You may have heard that term, and we'll be introducing that term again here in just a moment. So purpose and need is a fundamental core of any federally funded project like this. Why are we doing this project? What is the purpose of the project? And also, what is the need? So the purpose, as we say here, of this federal action, which is NRCS involvement in expending monies, it's to increase flood prevention and to increase watershed protection. We do that to reduce damages from flooding in and along the river floodplain, at the priority locations as determined through the study. And we talked about that a moment ago as we look at, the different alternatives and the focused areas. The proposed action is needed because of repeated flooding. Ayana had showed you photographs, and everybody is well aware, of the causes and damages that are happening out here, along the river floodplain. Next slide, please. Okay, so a little bit more on the planning process and this term NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, that became law in 1970. And it really does provide a strong framework for environmental protection and resource protection. Long gone is the day where folks just went out and bulldozed things and built stuff. There is a very, very systematic process that the federal government has been following for decades now. You can see in the graphic off to your right, a little bit more here, we have various phases. Phase one, which is where we're in right now, which is determining the objectives, identifying the problems, and analyzing, the resource data that's out there in the watershed. We're formulating alternatives. That's going to be our next step following these public informational meetings. And we're going to be evaluating those alternatives and then making decisions collectively in terms of which alternatives make most sense. That will be, accumulated in this watershed study and environmental document that Ayana and I have both mentioned so far. The public is going to have multiple opportunities to review and provide input as we go through this process. Phase three then is implement that plan, as we said earlier, in the design piece and then the construction, once the alternatives are identified, which ones make most sense and carried forward. Next slide, please. Okay, a little bit more on the overview of NEPA. What does NEPA do? What's its purpose? It requires the state, federal governments, the communities, the opportunity for public participation. One of the key reasons we're here this evening together is to provide opportunity for the public to weigh in and have their voice heard. It requires disclosure about the action. What decisions are made will be published. It's an additional opportunity for review. It requires considerations of various impacts, whether it's to the environment or social or economic resources as well. And this process overall really does result in better informed in decision making. Next slide. All right. Watershed plan, that will be the document that, that's going to be coming out of the conclusion of this planning phase. What are the key elements of a watershed project plan? Well, as we said, it considers, project alternatives. What is the options or the alternatives out there that we can make improvements on? It evaluates those project alternatives. We evaluate those against environmental and public concerns, existing conditions, all of those types of things. It develops, one alternative that really is consistent with, what's referred to as the NEE, the National and Environmental Efficiency, or the National Economic Development. Those are terms used by NRCS as part of this process. Ultimately, it determines if the project should move forward in meeting the needs of the community. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, the planning process. What are some of the things that we're going to be doing as part of developing this watershed plan? As we indicated, we're going to be gathering background data. We showed you a slide with a lot of reports that's been done and building upon that. We're going to be, coordinating with interested parties. We already are going through that process, whether it's the public, the folk that we're speaking with this evening, or others like the Watershed Council. We're holding public informational meetings in the city, the town, and anyone is able to join and participate in these. We're determining specific objectives, documenting those objectives. We're conducting inventory in the watershed of resources, and also conducting assessments for social and economic impacts and things like that. Again, we're formulating alternatives, we're evaluating those alternatives, and at the end, we're going to be identifying those one or two alternatives that makes the most sense. We've referred to that as the preferred alternative. And that gets a very detailed look at its impacts at an engineering level. Next slide, please. Alrighty, where's some of the resources that's part of the NEPA process? Well, we certainly give consideration to will this alternative or the preferred alternative have impacts to air quality, as an example, or the visual character and aesthetics of the area where it may go in. How does it affect land use? We take a look at all of that. Are there hazardous materials within that area that we may potentially be impacting as a result of this, or steer clear from them to make sure that we don't impact them? Biological resources, obviously aquatic organisms and buffer zones and trees and things like that. We're very, very careful not to be adversely impacting those type of resources. And then certainly infrastructure and utilities all come into this. Next slide, please. Alrighty, and lastly for me is the just additional resources considered as part of this process that NEPA requires as we go through the watershed plan, and certainly looking at water resources themselves. Geology and soils are very much part of, when we evaluate the specifics of this alternative or that alternative. Noise impacts, noise pollution. Does it impact it one way or the other? And as we've mentioned, cultural resources, and make sure that we're avoiding impacts to cultural or social economics. Certainly environmental justice is very much a central part of this as well as we go through and evaluate these. So here's kind of an outline for you. Certainly would hope to have some comments and questions from you folks at the end of this. But in the meantime, I'm going to turn it over to Andy Hoke, and he will be giving you some specifics on the measures that we're starting to think about. Andy?
Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Andy Hoke. I'm a water resource engineer with Ddk Engineering. Thank you for joining and participating in tonight's meeting. I'll be spending a few moments tonight talking about the various flood mitigation strategies that may be considered or used as part of this project. When we talk about flood mitigation strategies, really the main objective is reducing the amount of flow that arrives at the receiving water within the Woonasquatucket watershed. And also we're focused on reducing or eliminating the damages from flooding through these flood mitigation strategies. It's important to remember that there's a long menu of possible strategies that can be implemented. We may use just a singular strategy at a particular location, or combine multiple strategies together to get the desired effect. And the list that I'll be running through tonight is by no means complete. There may be others that will be considered. It really depends on the physical characteristics of the site and options that may fit within the natural environment best. So a few of the examples that I'll be talking about include flood volume or rate reduction. This is creation of large stormwater basins or modification of existing reservoirs. We'll be chatting about floodplain access and maintaining, improving access to the floodplain. We'll be touching on green infrastructure and some of the infiltrating and water quality benefits that are associated with green infrastructure. We'll be talking about avoidance, whether that be removal of existing structures within the floodplain, or possible floodproofing options, which include both wet and dry options to protect existing structures. And then finally, we'll be hitting on some of the different drainage improvement strategies that can be used, whether that includes improvement to existing drainage structures like culverts or box culverts, removal of the obstructions within the stream, or improvement of the channel itself. So let's move on to the next slide. So flood volume and rate reduction flood mitigation strategies. What we're looking to do with this strategy is disconnect the flow to the receiving water in some fashion. That could be through existing storm drains and diverting flows from a developed neighborhood to a stormwater detention basin. It could include modification to an existing reservoir spillway to create additional storage. The prime focus of this strategy, though, is to create storage volume where storm flows can be collected, detained, and then released at a controlled rate, which will reduce flooding in the downstream reaches. Next slide. Floodplains are an extremely valuable resource, and they serve not only to store the volume of stormwater that's generated during large events, but also has the added benefit of reducing flow velocities and erosive flows that may cause downstream damage. And just a basic background here, when we talk about floodplains, these are large, generally flat areas that are immediately adjacent to the river, that have been formed over hundreds and thousands of years through the migration or deposition of material adjacent to the river. Next slide. So green infrastructure. For those that aren't familiar with this term, really what we're talking about is incorporating the natural environment into a stormwater management feature. So we're looking for ways of collecting and infiltrating storm flows into the ground and introduce that flow to groundwater rather than have it run over the ground surface and entering receiving waters as surface flow. So not only are you reducing the amount of water that's arriving in the receiving stream, you also have the added benefit of improving water quality as vegetation is able to take up nutrients and contaminants that may be present in the stormwater. So next slide. And here just are a few little thumbnails of a few examples of green infrastructure. These strategies can range from implementing local zoning regulations where development is clustered into tight areas, and we leave large green spaces available, which will help absorb and mitigate storm flows. We could talk about including wetland buffers or vegetated buffers adjacent to the stream. There are plenty of infiltrating practices that we'll be looking at, including, like I said, rain gardens and bioretention areas. And we'll also be considering water harvesting strategies where, say, roof runoff from individual residences or commercial uses is diverted into a storage structure and then can be used later for irrigation or agricultural uses. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's an example of an avoidance mitigation strategy. Oftentimes we'll find that there are existing structures, residential or commercial, that are located within the floodplain. And after an economic type of analysis, we can consider whether or not removal of that structure makes sense both from a watershed and an economic perspective. Of course, there would be a valuation of existing properties and a determination of whether or not it makes sense to remove them. Here, the photos just illustrate an existing structure that's been removed and returned back to natural green space. Next slide. Another potential avoidance strategy could be raising existing structures outside or above the floodplain elevation. This is sometimes considered when we're looking at more historical or culturally valuable properties. Again, an economic analysis is included as part of the consideration of this strategy. In this photo, you can actually see that both of those structures, the brick structure and the white wooden structure in the background, have both been lifted above the floodplain elevation. Next slide. Okay, next we'll be hitting on a couple floodproofing strategies. There's both a wet floodproofing and dry floodproofing strategies that can be implemented. When we talk about dry floodproofing, really the objective is to prevent flood flows from entering existing structures. So we're improving the structure by adding shields at door and windows and the openings to the structure, and including backflow prevention devices such as on the sewer or storm drain or garage floor drain to prevent flows from backing up into the structure. And then the next slide will show us an example of wet floodproofing. And this is really the opposite of dry, where we're looking to move existing appliances, utilities within the structure above the flood elevation. So moving it from basement or first floor elevation to a higher floor where those appliances and utilities won't be impacted should the structure be inundated. Another really important component of wet floodproofing strategies includes providing openings on the foundation walls so that we're working with the environment and allowing flows to both enter and exit the structure as the floodwaters recede. Next slide. There are several different drainage improvement strategies that we'll be considering as part of the project. Probably one of the most common is looking at existing culverts and storm drains. So here we're looking at an existing box culvert that just from the photograph appears to be undersized based on the stream width or bankful width in the adjacent areas. This is a very common problem where existing culverts are undersized based on the change in climate due to additional flows and intensities or additional development that's occurred in upstream areas and the contribution of those additional storm flows to these crossings. Of course, any sort of improvement would need to be in concert and communication with state and local transportation regulations and authorities. So next slide, please. Okay, another mitigation strategy that we may be looking at is improvement of stream channels. During a preliminary site reconnaissance that I performed back in April, I noticed there were several areas in the downstream reaches of the Woonasquatucket that were highly channelized, vertical concrete walls that limited the area of flow for the river. Both eliminating such hardscapes on the channel walls and allowing additional access to floodplains will improve flood flows and flooding conditions in the downstream areas. Next slide. We'll also be looking at existing bridge decks within the watershed. And what we're focused on is the low chord elevation, which is the low point of the bridge in comparison to the normal water level in the river. And sometimes we find that the low chord of existing bridges is acting as an obstruction during larger storm events and flood events. We'll be considering potential modification of existing bridge decks, whether that's raising the deck or increasing the span of existing crossings. And next slide. Depending on the hydraulics of the stream in certain areas, you may have areas of deposition in the form of sand or silt bars. You may also find that there are obstructions that accumulate over time, whether that be woody debris, just trash in general, items that are preventing the natural flow of the river. Of course, we want to be very, very careful with this mitigation strategy. We understand that woody debris is extremely beneficial to aquatic biota and would only be used as an option if there's a true constriction in the river flow at an area. And as I mentioned here, of course, this would only be done with following communication with the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management and other environmental regulation agencies. Next slide. This is the final slide for me. So, of course, any of these mitigation strategies will consider the valuable cultural resources that are associated with them. Of course, Smithfield and Providence have many beautiful historical structures, and of course, those are structures that just cannot be replaced. So, as both Jeff and Ayana had explained, our analysis includes a careful consideration of the economic and cultural value of all the strategies that we'll be looking at. And with that, I will pass the presentation back over to Ayana. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I am here to talk to you again about the next steps that you will see for the project. So as you can see on your screen, we are going to document and assess the findings of these meetings. As I mentioned earlier, we will be receiving your questions and comments, and some of them we may not have a definitive answer to right now because we don't have all of the alternatives developed. We haven't made a lot of decisions about what we're going to recommend for this project just yet. But as we move through the process, we'll definitely take into account your concerns and your comments and areas that you think need to be focused on in terms of flood prevention in the project. So please do make sure to send those in. We're going to show you the project email address in the next few slides here. We're also going to be completing further field studies and investigations about the project in terms of research into documentation that's already been prepared and analysis that's already been done, but also going out into the field and seeing some of the effects of what the flooding is doing to the neighborhoods now, where the floodwaters reside, literally not just in an engineering hydraulic model, although that is important too. But we do want to see what it looks like on the landscape and if there are any features that haven't already been appropriately captured in terms of how they're interacting with the water. We will also be identifying and evaluating alternatives as we have gathered the information from the field and from further background data and the existing background data that we already have, to then develop alternatives, identify some areas we really need to focus in on, and some flood prevention features that would be important in those areas and probably blend in well with the aesthetics of the neighborhood. Definitely throughout the entire process, we will be coordinating with various governing agencies, agencies with permitting authority over the different construction features that we'd like to install in this watershed project, and agencies with governing authority just over, the natural environment in terms of how water is handled, how wildlife is protected, and how property rights are protected, and everything else that goes into making any modifications in a community. So we'll be presenting the alternatives that are developed. As I mentioned earlier, and the other two gentlemen talked about, we're going to have a draft watershed plan - environmental document that's developed, and we'll be having another public meeting when that's ready so that you can see the alternatives that we've looked at. There'll be some that we've ruled out, and we'll explain why. And then the ones that we want to proceed with, or the one rather, that will be the preferred alternative, that will be a suite of different tools that we have put together to address the flooding in the town and the city in this watershed. So once we do that, we'll show it to you, and you'll have a chance to review and comment on that. There'll be a comment period that follows just the initial presentation. And then we will take your further comments and any further comments from government agencies and any other members of the public that are concerned with the project. And then we'll finalize that watershed plan - environmental document. And once we finalize that document, we publish it again. So you do have another chance to see that we did incorporate your comments, that we were listening to what you had to say, and how we still plan to address flood protection while taking those things into consideration. And then the document goes through more review internally with my agency, the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And eventually it will be recommended to the head of my agency, who we call the chief, the head of the Natural Resources Conservation Service. The chief is Terry Cosby, and we will give it to him, and then he will make the decision about whether or not to approve it. And once it is approved, that is when it's qualified to request more funding to move into the next phase. So as Jeffrey mentioned, this project timeline is not going to happen overnight. It's going to take several more months, over a year more, for this phase that we're in now in terms of planning to be completed and to go through all those steps that I just mentioned: the draft phase, the public comment period after that, the final watershed plan - environmental document, and the comment period after that. So you can see that we did address your comments, and then going to approval with the chief of my agency. And then once that's done, being able to request funding for the design phase. And once we receive that, then we will move into the design phase and actually start to make more concrete decisions about how everything's going to lay out. The plan is going to tell you the different features, and it's going to have a concept design in it. But as we discussed, the concept design is only about a 10 to 30% design. So it's not going to give you all the information, not hardly. That's not the goal of a watershed plan. In here, we're trying to make sure we cover our basis and describe everything that we are going to do, but not in finite detail, like what you would get in engineering design. So those are some of the things that you can expect to see coming along here. And between now and when the draft watershed plan is developed, the project email address will be open. I mean, it will be open continuously. So if after the comment period, you have some more things that are nagging at you and you just have to, get off your chest, we want you to get it off your chest, we do. Please feel free to still send us an email about whatever that comment or question is. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so here you are. This is our project email address, woonasquatucket@duboisking.com. And the deadline for this first comment period is July 10th. we really wanted to have a focal time where we knew that you could have a moment to focus on the project shortly after we've given the presentation to help jog your mind about what's going on in the watershed and see if there's anything that you want to ask us to make sure that we took a look at, or any questions that you have, if you have concerns about how this watershed project will roll out and what it will look like in your community, and you want to make sure what it will do and what it won't do, and tell us some previous experiences you've had, maybe with other changes that have happened since you've been a resident there or had a business there or just been going to school there. Um, and we also will capture those, and they will be included in our watershed plan environmental document. As I said, you are welcome to continue to make comments after that deadline, but in this first sweep, if you make comments between now and July 10th, we'll definitely be able to make sure, the earlier you get information, the more able you are to apply it more broadly. And so the more information we can gather as soon as possible upfront, we can make sure that the watershed plan environmental document reflects consideration of all of that information. So please, if you would, send us your comments, your questions, use this project website, or ask your questions tonight. By all means, we're going to have time here in a few minutes, if I can just stop talking, and you will have another 45 minutes or so to just ask questions or say anything and tell us anything that you want us to know. And we really invite you to do that. We're looking forward to hearing from you. We want to know what your concerns are about flooding. If you think this project is a good idea, are we focusing in on the right neighborhoods? Do you have a neighborhood that you want to make sure we're aware of? Please share anything like that with us, because we want to know what a successful project would look like for you. If you have some specific areas of concern, we do want to hear about those as well. So questions, comments, any input, please feel free to share that with us now.
Okay, we do have some questions. There's a vast majority of them are in English, but there is one in Spanish, so we'll need some assistance on that. But to start off with, Eugenia Marks asked, how far downstream does this project extend to the hurricane barrier? If so, what is the jurisdictional area of Army Corps of Engineers for the hurricane barrier on the river side of the barrier?
Okay, so I am not sure exactly the jurisdictional area of the Army Corps of Engineers. We will not intersect. I can tell you from NRCS's perspective, generally when we install a structural measure like a hurricane barrier or a dam or a levee or anything of that type, there is the physical footprint of that structure itself. Then there is the part where it ties back into the natural landscape for a foundational assistance and stability. And then there's some area beyond that, like I was discussing earlier with our flood prevention channel example, where they're going to reserve, or we would reserve, and I believe the Corps works the same way, area for operation and maintenance. So that's an area that couldn't be built on. You can't have any permanent structures. You don't allow a lot of recreation that stays in place. It's more so people walking through, walking by, and not doing a lot of tremendous heavy activities there in terms of equipment resting on the spot and things like that. So I would think that there would be a pretty significant area that just surrounds the hurricane barrier that would still be part of the Army Corps of Engineers view of what is needed to keep that structure operational. And so NRCS would not touch that. The other part of your question, how far does the project extend downstream? We are looking at all of the Woonasquatucket River watershed that's in the city of Providence. But to that end, when we're developing flood prevention measures, we don't necessarily go to the border of the watershed. We'll go to the locations in the watershed where the flood prevention measures need to be installed. And then we will have a controlled release of the water, the flood waters, from our flood protection measures until a certain point, until it returns to what we determine is natural flow, which is normally what the normal flow of that water body, in this case, the Wooney, the river, is. and that's when we will determine the end of the project. So what we normally do is we do have some downstream maintenance that's beyond the actual physical end of the structure, but it may not be to the physical edge of the watershed itself. Hope that answers your question, but if not, please follow up. Did I get it all,
Okay.
Chris? Or is there
Yep,
more?
you did.
Okay.
We have another question from Eugenia that's the watershed map seemed to end at Water Place Park or perhaps the confluence of the Moosassuck. Is Water Place Park and the Amtrak service within the project area?
I think technically, yes, because it's in the city of Providence. However, railroads have their own authority. And so this project will not usurp any of the authority of the existing railroad. Railroads have quite a bit of authority and jurisdiction of their own. And we don't, in this project, would not have the authority to absolutely compel Amtrak to do anything in particular. And we recognize that Water Place Park is an important social and aesthetic feature in the neighborhood, and we're certainly not going to look to do anything to downgrade that.
Okay. So we do have a question in Spanish. It may be necessary, Ayana, for you to just switch over to the Spanish interpretation channel really quickly to get it interpreted for you.
Okay.
I'm hoping.
Hello. So, yes. Great. Okay. Got it. Thank you. Okay, so yes, with regards to the future, we will be having additional public meetings like this one. And as the health of the country and the situation with the pandemic improves and things get better, we will also have in-person meeting options most likely. And we will keep most likely as well some of these virtual meeting options so that we can try to capture the largest group of people possible. And whenever we have a meeting, whether it is virtual or in person, you are welcome to bring your children or other people in the community that may not have received the notice and you think that they would appreciate hearing the information or that they would learn something from it. Yes, absolutely. Those people are invited as well. When we send out the information, you know, we're a little bit limited in terms of who we can contact by physical addresses and then email addresses that we, our partners, or other community leaders have. So, but we are trying to reach the largest audience possible, and the whole public is welcome. So definitely children as well, yes.
Okay, and then we have another question that is, will you be looking at the Pleasant Valley stream section with flood walls and looking at restoring the natural channel?
We will be looking at the Pleasant Valley stream section in terms of the existing flood walls versus us putting in new flood walls, if that's the question that you're asking. We'll consider that section in terms of what we think the best flood protection measures are. If we determine from the hydraulic analysis that the flood walls are working, we would look to enhance them and maybe extend some of them. But if it turns out that that's not the most economically feasible and environmentally sensitive option, then we would not look to continue those features.
Okay, and we have a question from Laureen, which is, I see you, so you'll be reviewing previous plans such as the WRWC visioning plan that additionally considers providing community access to the river. A good example is the existing unused bridges that could be raised and converted to pedestrian and bike to accommodate pedestrian and bicycles. My question is, will you also be considering community usage and access? Thank you.
Okay, yes, we will be considering community usage and access in that we don't want to use our flood prevention measures necessarily in areas where it would be advantageous to create access to the river. However, in that this is the focus of this project is flood protection. We will not necessarily be constructing a park or walkways or anything like that under this project.
Okay, and then we have another one in from Maria Gutierrez that's in Espanol. So I don't know if you want to get the interpretation.
Yes, I will get the interpretation. So, hi, Fernando or Sherlyn, would you interpret Ms. I'm sorry, I've forgotten her name.
Gutierrez.
Ms. Gutierrez's question for me, please? I'm sorry, I'm not hearing the English interpretation. I can hear Fernando, but I hear him speaking in Spanish, not English. Okay, no, that's fine. Thank you. I will go. Okay. Yes, I can. Oh, I'm sorry. Both of you are talking at the same time. So the question has already been answered? Okay. Yes, I can hear you, Fernando. And okay, sure, said that. All right. Okay. Yes. Okay, sure. So I believe that Ms. Gutierrez, your question has been answered. If we are incorrect in that interpretation, please type the question in again. And I'm sorry if we've gotten that wrong. And then Ms. Matos's question about the trees intersecting with power lines and overhead cables, utility cables in the neighborhood, because as she has correctly noted, we started hurricane season on June 1st. It's always an exciting time on the East Coast. Oh, these last couple of years have been challenging depending upon which state in the East Coast you've lived in, but nobody's gotten off scot-free. Our agency, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, as part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, we are not responsible for that maintenance. My recommendation on those issues would be to, if you live in a neighborhood without a homeowners association, then I would say to contact the city or the town government. And as I mentioned before, we have Dave Everett with the City of Providence on the line, and we also have Mike Phillips. So gentlemen, feel free to weigh in if you know the agency or the department that she should contact for issues with, she has concerns with the trees intersecting with the overhead lines in her neighborhood, especially in hurricane season.
Hi, Mike Phillips.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, for questions like that, I guess it depends on which, is it a state right of way or a town right of way? In most cases, it's going to be National Grid is going to be the one to contact about power lines.
Right. I would concur with that, but you can always ask the Department of Public Works. There's probably a specific number, which I don't know offhand, in Providence.
Okay, thank you both for those responses. So Ms. Matos, hopefully you were able to hear those gentlemen and their recommendation to contact National Grid if you're in the town of Smithfield, or if you're in the city of Providence. You may also contact National Grid, but another good resource would be the Department of Public Works. Okay, I think we can move on to the next question, Chris.
Yep. So we have a question from Yasilia Mendoza. He says, hi there, I don't have a question, but more of an input concern. There's severe flooding occurs on Delane Street between Audrey Street and Sonoma Court. Please add this to our planning strategy. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Ms. Mendoza, and we certainly will. Thank you for pointing that out.
And then we have Myra Lopez asked a question asking, does every house within the flood zone require flood proofing?
So the flood proofing technique that Andy Hoax showed you earlier, those are options of techniques that we can use in certain situations where that makes the most sense. But every house that's in a flood zone, no, flood proofing will not necessarily be the solution for that house. Some of the other solutions that he showed may be more appropriate for that house, including avoidance, but also flood walls. And it just depends on how it lays on the landscape, where it is in the flood zone, what part of the floodplain it might be in, and some other factors like that.
Okay. And then Eugenia Marks asked, will sand used in winter for de-icing and erosion be an area for evaluation, since sand can impair stormwater control devices? Maintenance recommendations, could they be part of the plan?
The maintenance recommendations that will be enacted or enforced by my agency, so to speak, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, will be to do mostly with the flood protection structural measures or vegetative measures that are actually installed on the landscape. In terms of making recommendations to other agencies like the Department of Transportation, which is responsible for de-icing the roads, that is something that we would do in conversation and in partnership with them. We don't have, this project doesn't give us authority over their agency to necessarily tell them what to do, but we can make them aware of how some of their practices may negatively impact some of our flood protection measures, and we can have that conversation with them. But they have their reasons for why they do things a certain way. Budget is no small part of that. And so we'll have to take that into account when we're having those conversations with them. But our having or leading this project as the federal agency doesn't give us authority to tell another federal or state agency how to operate per se. Thank you for the question.
Okay. And looks like finally we've got someone who says that the project is great, that they believe this will be in action once jobs open up and become available to the community. And you did get a follow-up from Ms. Gutierrez, which said that you did answer the question correctly. And she said the most important thing is to raise awareness in children so that they take care of the environment in their city.
That's great. Thank you. Yes, I agree. We definitely want the children to be aware. They're the next generation of leaders, and we want them to be involved and understand what we're doing so that they can carry it on. So those are all the questions and comments that we have right now?
That is all the questions that we've gotten so far. Yep.
Okay. All right. Well, very good. Thank you. Very interactive. I appreciate that. I appreciate everyone taking the time out tonight to listen and to participate in this meeting. And we definitely look forward to seeing you again at future public meetings. And once again, if you have any thoughts that occur to you later, the comment period during this first portion is open until July 10th. And we have our project email address, and we would love to correspond with you that way. So please send us any questions to the project email address. It's great if you can do that. If you can send it there, then we'll have a focal point. I know that a lot of you know each other in the community, and you may know other people who are involved in the project, who work for the town or for the city or for the Woonasquatucket River Watershed Council, but we set that project email address up specifically so that we could focus on issues about this project in particular, because everyone has a lot going on. And we would love to see you use it, and we'd love to communicate with you that way. So there it is. Thank you, Chris. Put it on the screen again. Please write that down. And also, we didn't put it on the slide, but if you Google NRCS Rhode Island, just those letters NRCS and your state, Rhode Island, it will bring you one of the options. Google will pop up. Hopefully the first one will be our website, our NRCS Rhode Island state website. And if you can go on there, you will be able to navigate to the posted presentations. If you want to refer anybody else to that link to our presentations, we would greatly appreciate it. And they should be posted sometime in the next 2 weeks here. So if you can just look, the comment period will still be open. And we just want to share this with as many people as possible. So that information will be there, including the Spanish translation, by the way. That will be up as well. Okay. Well, if anybody had a last minute question that you thought of, feel free to type it into the chat. We'll give it a few more minutes, but we're not going to hold you. If we've answered all your questions and you made all the comments that you want to, have a good evening, and feel free to sign off at any point in time. All right, well, hearing no more questions, I think that we're going to end the webinar now.